So once again, welcome back to the This Sounds Better podcast with Miles Walker, Jason Kingsland, and myself, Alex Toomey. Today we are talking about mistakes. And to start it off, we're going to talk about the worst rookie mistake we've ever made. How about you, Jason?
Oh, there's so many to choose from on a daily basis. So here's my best one. One of my best ones, actually. I don't know if I can pick a favorite child, but mine is ultimately about getting a little bit too nervous and not allowing myself to fully pay attention to what's going on in my session. And here's the short of it. Young, up-and-coming cat. I'm probably 22 years old, and I'm on a session that's on tape.
Ooh.
And, yeah, ooh. For anyone who doesn't know, you can fuck your shit up on tape. It's very easy. If you make a bad punch, if you raise something, you are forever fucked up. And I'd worked on tape before. I was really comfortable with it, but this was a really interesting session. There was a marquee rock engineer in Atlanta for a while, and I was recording his brother's record. And this guy was a fairly popular, successful engineer that I really looked up to, and I really wanted this guy to be like, man, for a young kid, you're really good. And I'm recording his brother's stuff, and we get all the way through this take. Solid take. And the bass player had like fucked up the bridge or something. But I'm recording on like an old machine, and you can see on the remote what you've got track armed. I stop the take once we're done with it. Bass player's going, oh, I want to punch the bridge. The engineer whose brother I'm making the record for is sitting in the back of the room, and I am fucking sweating bullets nervous. Just, have you guys ever had that moment where you feel like you're going to puke from like being nervous? Yeah. Like, it's like
first
that
time in the chair.
Of, like, nervous. I forget to unarm all the tracks on the machine.
Oh no.
Oh no.
And so I go to like punch in the bass part. We get to it, and I'm like, just like, all right, I gotta get this punch, bang on. I'm gonna nail this punch. And I punch the entire fucking multi-track out. Like, literally, like, you go to make the punch, and all you hear is the bass that I'm punching in. And everyone in the room looked at me, because it's nothing but like 50-year-old dudes. Like, and half the players were engineers. Like, everyone knew what I did fucking immediately. And so my fuck up was allowing myself to be so nervous that I couldn't even like maintain where I was at. I couldn't even begin to process that I was about to really fuck some shit up, because I'm trying to like look good in front of everyone. And that got me nowhere.
I think we all have that I got too nervous story. And I don't think maybe, I think I'm lucky that tape wasn't involved. You know what I mean? In my first session where I just didn't know what to do and my hands were shaking, and just hitting 3 was a nightmare. Luckily enough for me, tape had kind of been phased out of the equation by the time I started engineering. So that really wasn't the issue for me. I guess for mine, the issue has been overall in my career, just getting a little bit too comfortable with the situation and being a little bit too friendly. And as far as the rookie version of that, I would say when I was interning for Ben and Jason, Ben used to send me out with the artists when I was an intern. So we were mostly working with indie rock bands, and those dudes wanted to go out. They wanted to hang out in the city. You know what I mean? They wanted to go out, when Ben was mixing or when we were finished with takes and he was comping and stuff like that. So they wanted to go out to dinner. They wanted to go to bars. They wanted to, party. And it was kind of my job to be like the city liaison for them. And the first, 20 artists that we had, I would be like, just there. I was definitely not partaking. And then one day Ben was like, hey man, here's some money, take the artists out, show them a good time. And the artists were like, Alex, we're raging tonight. And they went straight to the liquor store instead of anything else. And we bought like the crappiest whiskey. You know what I mean? And we all had our own handle. And by the end of the night, I was obliterated. And then we still had to be in session at 8 a.m. the next day. And I know Jason remembers this because, it wasn't a one-time thing, but I just remember in my head being like, this is a mistake. And it wasn't anything other than I had to be in session for 12 hours the next day with the worst hangover of my life. And I wouldn't say that it was a mistake that was so detrimental to me as a person or my career, as much as it let Jason and Ben torture me the entire day.
And full-blown alcoholism, but, whatever.
Yeah, you know.
Right, you're just skating past that little side effect.
You know. I think throughout my career, though, like, being too comfortable has been a thing, either in the engineer's chair where I'm just like, I'm too confident. I'm really happy with what I'm doing and I'm recording and, I might make a mistake there or whatever it is. Overall for me, like the one thing that I'm now super aware of is I get too comfortable.
That's kind of closely related to my story, where it's less about being comfortable with an artist or relation, because I try and be mindful of that and always have been, but I've always fancied myself as very knowledgeable. So I'm kind of sometimes overly confident in my gear knowledge. And one of the mistakes I made was on one of my early sessions where I was working for the first time with a new engineer and, I had come recommended. So I was like kind of feeling myself. And it was back in Nashville and we were actually working on a very different type of multi-track recorder called Radar.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people probably don't even know what that is unless maybe you are listening in Nashville. And functionally, that's just like a linear disc multi-track recorder. So think about it just like Jason's story with tape, where, you record straight down, but it's just to a computer. But it is not like Pro Tools where you can have little blocks of audio and edit it around and stuff like that. Now, I had never even heard of Radar or seen Radar at all. I was Pro Tools and tape. That's all I knew about. When I got to the session, the engineer was like, great, we're cutting on Radar today. You're good with that, right? And I was like, absolutely. Again, not having any idea what Radar actually was. But I wasn't about to be like, hey man, I don't really know that. I was just confident. I was like, I can figure it out as I go. It even started when we got to the control room and I'm looking at all these boxes and he looks over at me and he's like, bring the recorder over here, pick up the radar, let's go. And I see a lot of different things, mystery boxes. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's a compressor. I'm pretty sure that's a reverb chamber or some kind of mystery box. And then this like random black box. And I'm just going to go with the fact that that's Radar. I'm committed at this point. So I walk slowly over to it, grab it, dead eye looking at him, dripping sweat. And he's just like, so you bringing that thing or what? And I was like, oh yeah, here we go. Great. And he's just like, go ahead and hook it up to the multi-track. And I spin the thing around and thank God it was like simply labeled, like all the inputs. And I was able to patch it into the patch bay so that it was coming off there. And then I knew it was over because that was it. I didn't know anything past hooking this thing up and I was about to go down in flames. I guess that was a bad rookie mistake, but I got the grace of God on that one. And he was like, hey, you know what? I'm going to set up the session and, you can just go fix up these microphones. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be helpful there. But man, if it had come to actually setting up the Radar session and launching it, I think I would have been career over before it even began.
I have a question. Do you think he knew?
If I got to be really honest with myself, I think he knew. Because if he would have put me to the test, it would have been just a bloodbath. And more importantly, it would have been a bloodbath in front of the clients. And maybe that looks some kind of way on him, having an assistant that has no idea what's going on. So we never talked about it, but I could see that he probably did know. And I really got lucky on that one.
So one comment on that. Shout out mentors.
Real talk.
Shout out engineers teaching assistants teaching interns. Like, one thing I'll say is in my life, I've been in that situation a lot. And I know I've been working with Jason and assisting Jason where he's been like, hey man, you want some help with that? Like quietly. Or hey man, nice. I'll just do it. You know what I mean? And I'll just sit there and kind of watch him tweak the EQs or, set up the vocal chain or something like that where I was having a big problem and he kind of just said, I got this. And that was the saving grace for me. And, I've tried to kind of impart that on all of my interns and assistants, but I've also witnessed some of the worst mistakes being a mentor to a lot of assistants and interns. And, that kind of brings us to the next topic, which is like, what's some of the worst mistakes we've witnessed? And I think we've all seen some shit. Personally, mine is, when I was running DARP, right when we first started. So we had to have a lot of interns. I think we had maybe 6 or 7 on staff at a time minimum. And, so the turnover rate was insane. So we're bringing in a new intern every few weeks just to kind of fill up one of the intern spots that were missing. And we kind of just had to throw them in the day they showed up. And so one day this kid came in and he interviewed better than literally any other intern I've ever had. His interview, he could not have answered every single one of my questions better. One of the most personable people I have ever met in general. And on his first day, he made friends with pretty much everybody just by being himself. He was super helpful, had a smile on his face, was ready to go. But unfortunately, maybe for him, he was working on one of those days that was kind of one of those party days where it was a session where Dallas Austin was in town. And whenever Dallas was in town at DARP, everybody in Atlanta kind of showed up to get in on whatever session he was doing. And he was doing a Monica session. So in the main A room was him and Monica, and they were producing and recording a lot. And, in the front of the studio, there's, I don't know, 40, 50 people just ordering alcohol, drinking, hanging out, reminiscing about the old days, whatever it may be. But they're sending interns out on alcohol runs. And they send this intern out to go buy alcohol, and he comes back with alcohol for everybody. And they were like, keep the change. But with the change, he bought himself a bottle of liquor. And I didn't know this at first, but he had been kind of like sipping the whole day. So by the end of the day, he had all this undeserved confidence, and he went straight into the back room because I guess Dallas had told him that he'd be down to listen to his music one day, and like brought in a hard drive and was like, Dallas, is this a good time for you to listen to my beats? Mid vocal take. And Dallas comes out and he's like, hey man, I don't want to like snitch on an intern, but like this is one of the craziest things that's ever happened to me. So I had to bring the intern aside and be like, hey man, this is your first day. This is like 6 months in, I might be able to let this slide, but you gotta go. And then he was like trying to explain like how bad he wanted it and all this other stuff. And I was like, look, in what world would you have thought getting wasted and like, trying to pitch your beats mid vocal take was a good idea? Like if that's the way you're starting, you gotta go. But I couldn't even fire him because he had to drive home. So I had to have, I had to have him sit down and sober up for 5 hours before I could send his ass home.
In truly parallel fashion, the worst thing I've ever seen is also related to an intern's first day and alcohol, if you can believe it.
No.
It was, you never knew how many problems this was going to create. But this problem was a little different as it was, he became known as Sixpack. Literally don't even know the kid's name. But he also didn't get fired, which is amazing, an addendum. It was a party session. And Khan had some people over and he was just like, hey man, can you send one of the interns to go get some beer for me? And I was like, yeah. And the new intern comes in and I was like, here's some money. Akon wants a 6-pack. And he leaves. And he's out for like a really long time when there's a gas station right around the corner. But anyway, he comes back in about an hour later with a full case of beer, drinking like one in face, walks right up to Akon, drops it in front of him and goes, they didn't have a 6-pack. Guess you'll have to stop being such a pussy and drink these. Like, to his face.
Go.
Khan just looking literally right at me. Dude finishes his beer in the room and then walks out. Khan looks at me and is just like, you know he can't come back in, right? I was like, yes, I do know that. And I walked right out and I was like, dude, are you insane? And I mean, like, obviously he's drunk, literally missing about half the case. So dude had put
Holy
down like,
shit.
close to 12. I don't know. And, maybe he had some friends. I have no idea. But straight up on your first day, calling an artist a pussy for only asking for a sixer. Yo, respect.
I hope that dude has a Grammy now. I hope he's,
I hope so too. I hope he's killing it.
I hope you don't know his name, but he's
killing
like
it right
one
now.
of the biggest engineers right now, and he's listening.
Yeah. Look, shout out to Sixpack, wherever you are, man. Keep doing your thing. Obviously, it's going well for you.
All right. So thematically, you have two people who got way too fucking comfortable in both of your stories. I've got a tangent topic on this. And my story is that when I had first become a chief engineer of a place, and again, like I was pretty young when this happened. I think I was 23. And mine is an intern who didn't know to ask questions. I feel like this is a really good point, a follow-up for how to be in a studio. But just to be very clear here, ask fucking questions, everybody. If you don't know, ask someone. We want to know, because this happened to me. Sitting there, and like, if you ever interned in a studio, there's always some variety of like chores. There's, everyone jokes about like the clean the toilet shit, but like really, people have to clean the fucking toilets. And so like I'd gone through with this kid and I'm kind of walking him through, and this wasn't day one. This is like day 50 for this guy. But he was never the night guy. He was always the day guy. And so at the end of the night at the studio, we would always run the dishwasher and clean up the studio and make sure that everything was ready to go in the morning. So the morning intern could unload a dishwasher, etc. So I'm going like, all right, dude, like, listen, like, you gotta get out of here, like, clean up all the coffee cups, get all the dishes up, put it in the dishwasher, go for it. And then I go in the back of the studio. This is a big complex. It's probably like 10,000 square foot studio. I go in the back 50 feet away and I start mixing a song. I'm working on a track, or I can't even remember what I was doing. And 20, 30 minutes later, this kid's dipped the fuck out. He's done all his chores. He's gone. And I walk out in the hallway and there's fucking 8 foot of suds, floor to ceiling, of like soap suds. This motherfucker had put dish soap in the dishwasher and had fucking annihilated the studio. It looked like a fucking rave in this fucking like wildly expensive fucking studio. And I can't blame them. They didn't know, which blows my fucking mind. They didn't know to put dish soap, or not to put dish soap and put detergent in the dishwasher. But y'all, ask a fucking question,
Right.
Another thing to add to that point, which is if it's a question like that, ask immediately. But say you're an intern and you have a few questions just from like while you're observing a session. The time to ask is not when you're in the session. If you're viewing an engineer work, the time to ask is a little later. And that kind of brings us to the next point, which is studio etiquette, how to behave so you don't make these mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One thing I used to do as an intern and was a really good thing was you're going to see questions you have pop up in the moment. And if they're not mission critical ones like dish soap in the dishwasher, write it down in a book. And if you have a little or a note sheet or something like that, and then, when the session's wrapping up, maybe you can kind of step to the engineer and be like, hey man, I saw you were doing this one thing. I just wondered, I had never seen that happen. Why were you doing it that way? And that's a comfortable time to ask. So yeah, picking your times to be out of the spotlight is just as important as picking your times to be in the spotlight when you're an intern.
Well, I think there's a really easy hierarchy. If anyone out there is getting into the like traditional old world structure of like intern to assistant to engineer to producer kind of way of climbing the ladder, there's a really simple hierarchy that you can follow. And if you think like this, you will be 85% correct most of the time. And it's this. If you're the intern, you are there to help the assistant. If you're the assistant, you're there to help the engineer. If you're the engineer, you're help the producer. And if you're the producer, you're there for the artist. So like whatever helps those people up in the hierarchy, just do it. And try and pay attention and you don't have to be speaking to be paying attention.
Something to that exact point, knowing the hierarchy, that's the person who you should be, the next person in your own hierarchy is the person you should be paying the most attention to. Because if that's the job you want to get next, pay attention to the very next job you're going to get. Don't just try and jump to the end of the line and notice like, put all your concentration in what the mixer's doing, tweaking an EQ. There's going to be time for that. But, if you're an intern, concentrate on being a great intern and then becoming a great assistant, because that's going to be your next job before you jump right into being a mixer.
I think when it comes to basic studio etiquette, always err on the side of silence in the moment. Like, if you're an intern and you have a question and there's a lot of shit going on, don't say anything. If you're an intern and you don't know whether or not you should speak up about something that's wrong in the session, don't say anything. If you're an assistant and you got to fix something, do it quietly. if like, there's always a text that you can send. There's always something you can do to be a little bit like subtle about whatever you're doing, because there's a whole thing about engineering where if the artist loses faith in you as an engineer, then the session might be over. You know what I mean? So, and an intern could ruin that by being like, hey man, maybe you shouldn't do that right there.
Right.
Never do that. Never do that. And then say you're doing that and you're in the session and you ruin the session, your career's over. Whereas you can just send a text and be like, yo man, I see you fucking up right now. And the engineer will forever be grateful to you for doing it the quiet way.
I think that in a lot of ways, like, if you accept the hierarchy of like, I just got to make all these people that are over me look good. Even if you're the intern, paying attention to what's going on and being discreet and not talking out of turn. And for me personally, that doesn't mean sit there and shut the fuck up, kid. I don't care what you think. In a lot of ways, like, I'm happy to see your vantage, but you've got to find the exact right moment to voice that vantage. And how are you going to make it the most beneficial to the people that are directly over you?
Well, I think that thinking about that mindset, that keeps as going as you move on up the chain. If you do make it to an assistant, then your responsibilities shift again. Now maybe you can kind of help the interns make those good decisions concurrently while you're trying to help the engineer have a good session. You kind of become maybe the point person for that information. Maybe the intern sees something wrong. They should be confident to come to the assistant, and the assistant can almost filter out, like, the engineer doesn't really need to know about that. That's not a big deal, but I'm glad you picked up on it, whatever. Or, yo, this is mission critical. Let me pass this along in a real subtle way. And by going through that standard chain, that becomes a really important thing for the assistant to help out, is the liaison to all the different parts that are working on the session.
I think when it comes to being like an assistant specifically, your job is not only helping the engineer, but now you're also delegating information to the interns. And so you have to be able to be friendly with everyone the whole time, but like, you're not their friends. You know what I mean? So like, you have to help the engineer and make his day better, but you also have to, be stern with the interns and still kind of like make them want to be there. Everybody should want to be around you at all times. I think that's kind of the goal of like the studio etiquette conversation, is you got to kind of keep everyone around you happy at all times. And the easiest way to do that is to not interject into situations you don't belong. And it's not to say that like your opinion isn't valid. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's don't come into the studio and be like, hey man, I don't like that effect. Well, you know what I mean?
I think that in a lot of ways with assistants, that a lot of the guys who become the real crack shot assistants and probably have a better shot of escalating to engineer are the guys who get to be really intuitive about something. That the guys who are hearing like, so like we're probably gonna cut some drums and we're gonna do some vocals, and then there's gonna be like guitars later in the day and, probably a bass thing tonight. When they're hearing that and quietly going like, okay, like I'm gonna get this all set up to the best of my abilities and have the patches thrown and have you guys set up. It's like, hey, it's in Pro Tools 2122, whatever it is. So that when they get to those tasks, they're already covered. You're not stopping to break your workflow to reset up for these things or whatever.
I think also that assistant position is where you can kind of let more of your personality start coming through. Maybe you were a little subdued as an intern because, you wanted to play it right. But now that you're closely interacting with the engineer, you also have to let your personality come through, because an engineer is probably going to spend more time with their assistant than they spend with their entire family, which is crazy, but it's what it is. So you also want to enjoy being around that assistant. So, personality is going to come into play and, connect well with people, like you said, be intuitive. All those kind of come together to be jobs that an assistant should be concentrating on while they're working.
I think one thing that I should touch on too is you don't want to be too quiet. You know what I mean? And I don't think this is really an etiquette point. It's just another kind of mistake to avoid. Like the first internship I ever had, I kept to myself. I did a really, 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 really good job at being the best guy to make the coffee and keep the studio clean. And that didn't inspire anyone to help me out or make me an assistant. I just was the best cleaner ever. I was a great janitor, and they were like, yeah, we should keep him as that. because no one else does a better job. And other people who are not as good at being an intern as I am moved up the ladder quicker because they made people want to help them. Whereas I was just the quiet guy that was really, really good at keeping the studio
I think
organized.
in a lot of ways, like with all these roles, we've all heard the pitch of get in the room, shut the fuck up. No one even cares about who you are. And I feel like that's a very dated, arcane way of talking about interns. But ultimately, with any of these roles, from intern all the way up to producer mixer, is that the more that you remember that your interaction with anyone who's a client is not about you. And so there'll be times to interject yourself, and there will be appropriate times, and you should assert yourself, and you should put yourself in the moment when it's appropriate. And the knack it comes in for knowing when to interject yourself and when to assert yourself as a professional or someone of greater utility, and when just to say like, yo, I'm laying back and I'm letting other people take the shine right now. But there will be an appropriate moment for me to do that as well.
And I think that's honestly the whole point of this etiquette conversation again is if you're unsure, err on the side of safety. And ask the right questions, ask the questions when you think you're supposed to, interject when you think it's appropriate. But if you don't know that it's appropriate, just don't do it. Like if your boss is like, hey, have a beer with me, and you drink beer, have a beer with your boss. If your boss is like, yo, you want to go outside for a smoke, and you smoke cigarettes, go have a cigarette with your boss. I'm not encouraging either of those for people who don't drink or smoke cigarettes. But if you do those things and your boss is like, let's hang out and be friends, it's friend time. It's time to ask the questions. It's time to hang out. It's time to make a friend.
You kind of got to watch that shit. Because as the engineer, you're the responsible guy. And me and you have talked about this, Alex, of being like, you cannot go out and be like 30 minutes into the session, like, I'll have 3 beers with the artist because that's going to make me cool. Frequently, that is a test.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, it's always a test. It is always a test. Anytime you're in the engineer chair and a rapper hands you like a blunt, they just want to see if you care about the job. Like I know for everybody that has the opportunity to engineer for Thug, I'm gonna give you a little secret. Don't smoke that. Just don't do it.
Miles? I think, when you're talking about responsibilities of an engineer, the main responsibility of an engineer is keep the pace of the session going, whatever it is. And like, how can you in your right mind know what the pace of the session is if you're not in your right mind? So while that can be a vibe thing, like you said, more often than not, it's really just a test of seeing like how focused you are on the session and paying attention to everybody. Now, if they want to party and do it, as an engineer, you should facilitate them, but that doesn't mean facilitate yourself in the same way. It's really more just like, let this happen. Let this be the vibe. Whenever they're ready to record, I'm going to be right there and, hook them up with whatever it needs to be. But you're on the clock. You're in the service industry and you're there to serve their creative nature.
And I think that's another point that we should touch on is this is a service industry. Specifically interning, assisting, and engineering. You are providing a very specific service and you need to do that first and foremost. And everything else comes after. And like, producer mixer, that's a little different because you are providing a service, but you are more on the creative and artistic side, at least in the perception of everybody involved. So you have a little bit more leeway to be a little bit more yourself, but you've also earned that. You've already gone through the ringer of interning, assisting, engineering most of the time, at least for being like a mixer. Yep. You've done all 3 of those. So you kind of know how to act. You know how to carry yourself and you know what the boundaries are by that point. So you can, push them a little as a mixer because you want people to respect you on the same level as that point, or else it's going to be really hard to convince them that you know better. Or at least that what you're doing creatively is worth believing in if they're unsure. And so those are things that, like, as you go, the lessons that you've learned along the way, you can kind of bend. But I think what we're trying to impose on everybody is like, until just be safe. And so I guess that's a good point to wrap it up. Because we just want y'all to be safe out there. Thank you for listening to This Sounds Better podcast. This is Jason Kingsland, Miles Walker,
Wrap it up,
and
y'all.
Myself, Alex Tumay.
and stop being such a pussy and drink the whole case.